Hey everyone, and welcome to AI What the Tech. This is episode 1 again, but this time it's the version we meant to make.
This is our redo because honestly, the first time around, we were kind of figuring out how to record while we were recording.
That's saying it lightly. So, just as by way of introductions again, since we're redoing it, I'm Sean Huss. I'm a sociologist, a stats guy, a professor. And while I keep up with technology, I'm not an expert by any stretch of the imagination on technology in particular. I am on the AI task force, and being on the AI task force has sparked in me a real fascination and really honestly fear about what's coming next. So much so that I'm reading everything I can about AI, and I'm now working toward an AI engineer certification with IBM. So I'm really getting into this now.
Cool. Best of luck with that.
Yeah.
All right. And I'm Bhaskar Ghosh. I'm a professor. I'm a researcher with a deep passion for AI. I've been in it for a while now. And that's kind of put me into more research with accessibility and innovation. I'm always working to push forward initiatives and expand student AI research opportunities across all disciplines because, I've realized that AI
Mhm.
isn't just a one siloed thing. It touches every discipline that's out there. Now, I
Yeah.
love the idea of using tech to make life easier for people. And, this podcast is how we meet in the middle, right, Sean?
Exactly. And, as part of this effort, we've been trying to get our heads around AI. And to be honest, Bhaskar has really pretty much become more my Virgil,
Mhm.
guiding me through the neural net inferno, if we can use that sort of analogy, as we try to make sense of the impact of AI, not just in universities like ours, but more broadly in higher ed.
Absolutely. And this is where this podcast comes in. Now, our original episode 1 was, have you heard it, Sean? All right, I'm
Yeah,
just going to use the word fine,
yeah, that's
but
that's
we didn't.
that's kind.
Right, but we didn't have a structure, we didn't have a voice yet, and we had no idea how deep this was going to go. Now,
Mhm.
we did have some ideas after attending our conference in Florida, but now that we know at least a little about production and have done several interviews, I think we both realized that this is a much larger and more profound transformation coming, not just at our institution, but in higher education. It's crazy.
Right. I mean, now that we're 8 episodes in,
Hmm.
well, 7 if we want to throw the other one out, we've seen how AI has changed our classrooms. We've seen how it changes professors' workflows. It changes how the students do work. And in some respects, it even changes our sense of reality. And after reading quite a bit more than we had, particularly by episode 1, particularly me,
Right.
episode 1, the original, in talking with everyone, I think we realize now how truly bad that first episode was. So when you say fine, I think you're being kind. I listened to it before this and I was going, oh my God. So in a world where we got to talking and we got to thinking that, in a world where AI lets you rewrite and regenerate and rethink, uh, why not take a redo? I mean, that's how the idea came up, right? It was just, hey, well, let's just redo it. And honestly, I think maybe that's the most authentic way to start a podcast about living through technological change. Is just being open to the possibility that we can go back and try it again.
Absolutely. I mean, AI reshapes how we approach revision. And the significance isn't the ease of editing, but in when those edits lead to clarity rather than distraction.
Right. And this is really the reason we started this to begin with, which is, we're going to screw up. I do it in my classes all the time, and students love it when they catch me. And this is us redoing it. And we're really here to talk about what AI really is.
Hmm.
That's going to be the distinction. We're not just talking about the tech side,
Right.
we're talking about the tech and social integration that's occurring in higher ed, but more broadly as well. We do want to talk about what it means for higher ed and the humans inside it, I guess is
Right.
one way to put it.
Hmm.
And we've never had the goal of making millions of dollars. That would be nice,
It
though.
would be.
We just want to just start a conversation
Right.
between two poles.
Right.
And now that we've begun the conversation, it seems like people are starting to like it. So we figured let's do better, right?
Right, and it's catching on. And this episodes or this podcast isn't scripted, and the episodes you watch really are in the moment. Although we do have an outline.
We
That's
do
just
have
yeah,
outlines.
it's
We have
just
to have outlines.
right. But in the end, this podcast isn't performative. It's a real time attempt to think together about something that's moving much faster than policy, pedagogy, or politics can catch up. Honestly.
Absolutely true. So, whether you're a professor, a student, an administrator, or someone just trying to make sense of what's happening, welcome to the new and improved episode one entitled Ready Episode One.
Now, this is the one we should have done, but I'm going to go easy on ourselves. So let's get into what AI actually is and why naming it wrong might be our biggest blind spot. So that leads us into the segment of what is AI, or how we are confusing AI by encompassing one term for many technologies. All right. So
Right.
we tend to lump everything together as humans because it's easier for our brains to kind of put it in a box. Now, from generative AI and facial recognition to hiring algorithms and surveillance systems, we are naming everything under one vague term called AI, right? But that's not true. Every system is fundamentally different. They have a different purpose, they have a different impact, they have different risks. Now, treating them all just the same clouds the conversation, and it also slows down meaningful progress as well. That's what I feel.
No, I think you're right. And this is one of the first things that in my study of AI certification they talk about early on is it's the terminology. And so calling all these things one thing is inherently misleading. And that's the AI snake oil book in particular says that using one term for systems is different as recommendation engines, chatbots, and automatic grading tools makes it harder to figure out the risk that's involved with each one of these things.
Absolutely.
So ultimately, we can't call everything AI. It's like, and they use the analogy of the vehicle. And this is what we talked about in the first shot at that first episode. We
Hmm.
didn't explain clearly. I think it makes more sense to think of it in terms of nested terms. So I'm going to take a stab at something that I should be learning. And this was homework in one of the classes. And that is, I'm going to try to nest the terms here. Tell me when I get it wrong. And first, the broadest term is going to be artificial intelligence.
Hmm.
That's the broad field.
It's everything.
It's yeah, right. So everything falls under AI. So underneath that, you have machine learning, which is going to be a subset of AI,
Yeah.
and that's where the machines learn from the data to
Hmm.
try to improve performance. Am I getting the sense of it now?
Right. Hmm.
So, and you have different kinds of learning like supervised and unsupervised
Hmm.
and reinforcement.
Yep.
That gets back to the question I brought up in episode one where I was saying, how do you reinforce? Well, it's really just a pattern of reducing the error of the
Right.
machine
It's the
learning
cost function that
process.
needs to go down.
Right. So then beyond that, what you have is you have deep learning.
Hmm.
And deep learning is ultimately going to use artificial neural networks, which are
Hmm.
going to be modeled on our biology and
Yep.
how our neurons can act. And you can have different kinds of neural networks. And I'm not trying to geek out as much as maybe show off a little bit for Bhaskar that I actually am reading, but
No, but
also,
everybody needs to know that this is a
right,
hierarchy that's
right,
maintained.
right. Well, and also for our colleagues in social sciences and the humanities,
Hmm.
I think the nesting helps them make sense. So then you have natural language processing, which is really the thing that allows AI to understand, generate, and respond to human
Hmm.
language. So that's where the chat bots are.
Yes.
That's where the text summarization is. And interestingly enough, GPT, everybody just kind of uses that. That really refers to generative pre-trained transformer, if I
Transformers.
remember
Yes.
correctly,
Hmm.
which means it's going to generate new text and it's trained on massive amounts of existing text
Yep.
to ultimately do it. And so underneath all of that, you have generative AI, which is like
Hmm.
Chat GPT, et cetera. So to summarize the hierarchy, AI is probably the wrong term because you have different kinds of specific AI that you're dealing with, generative, predictive, surveillance.
Right.
And then we also have to pay attention to that those determine how we use AI.
Hmm.
So the breaking it apart helps us figure out the risk that's associated with every form of AI more broadly. Is that how did I do
Absolutely,
it?
yes. I couldn't have put it much better. I mean, that's just the way that it needs to be said out loud, and more people need to understand because we're using it in our day to day lives at this point, and without people being aware of it, it's just tough on them to or tough on everybody else to expect them to understand what's happening. Now,
Hmm.
Kate Crawford calls AI a planetary system. It's not floating in the cloud. It's built on cobalt sweat, server farms, and surveillance. At the end of the day, right? And
Right.
a quote from Atlas of AI: "Artificial intelligence is neither artificial nor intelligent. It is
Hmm.
made from natural resources and human labor. It is a part of a wider planetary network of extraction."
Right.
Which
And
kind of
that's
goes to show, yeah, which kind of goes to show how important data is and how important everything that's being fed into the neural networks are.
right. I mean, it's essentially at the end of the day, we give it this sort of power that it really doesn't have. It's really us. It's
All
an
right. Mm-hmm.
expression, an extension of us. It's a tool. And ultimately, if we think of it as an artifact, and so we're referring just broadly so you guys know, there's a book by Kate Crawford called Atlas of AI, Power Politics and Planetary Cost. And then there's another one, Langdon Winter, which is The Well and the Reactor. These are really good books to kind of help us make sense of this in a broader context. But Winter,
Right.
in particular, says, these are artifacts, and do they have politics? And the answer is yeah, but it's in their application. It's not
Mm-hmm.
the tool itself that has an artifact. So tools don't just do things, they do them for someone and to someone.
Mm-hmm.
And so by creating these things, they have an inherent political problem.
Right.
And that's where the nexus between the technical and the social start to pull together.
Mm-hmm.
So AI isn't just a tool, it's a system. I think that's the easiest way to think about it. And to understand how we got here,
Mm-hmm.
we have to take a look back. And that's why we did that in the first podcast. I
We
thought you
did.
did a good job.
Right. And
So you want to
mhm. Yeah,
walk
I'll
us
try to
through
take
it
a
again?
stab. Yes, I'll try to take a stab at that and kind of walk through how we are where we are today. So in the 1940s to the 1980s, everybody started asking the question, or researchers started asking the question, how can we build a mind out of logic, right? So we
Hmm.
just didn't wake up in a world of ChatGPT. This began in the 1940s. Symbolic AI, which is actually making a comeback right now. Neurosymbolic AI is a big thing. So symbolic AI, which is a logic based system design, it was made, it had like if then rules. Alan Turing did wonderful work in trying to put this forward, or take this forward. Herbert Simon, Marvin Minsky. So a quote from Shannon Colton says the symbolists believe that intelligence could be attained through the manipulation of symbols and rules. Their primary focus was on representing logic and reasoning within machines. Right, so
Hmm.
this was a very preliminary thought process that we kind of work with, and when we hit the 1980s, that's when the maturing phase started. Now, progress was slow until we got better data, we got better algorithms, and we got better hardware. And
Right.
this not been said enough, but for a very long time, hardware was what was limiting progress in AI, because hardware wasn't small enough, right? We already had all of our sci-fi movies, which were saying, well, you can have a chip that can do this for you, you can have that does that for you, but then we didn't even dream about a 1 TB data storage back then. Like,
Hmm.
just let that sink in. Like
Right.
256 was probably like, huge. Now that's when artificial neural networks came in and deep learning came in. Um, Hardware got smaller, and that's when 2012 happened, and the ImageNet competition.
Hmm.
AlexNet was built. This was one of the biggest breakthroughs. Again, this the funny thing is, this wasn't a language model, this was a vision model,
Hmm.
a picture image model, right? So that was the first thing that kind of blew up, and I was behind the idea that images are going to blow up faster than language models. But thanks to OpenAI, language models kind of took off, and everybody knows about ChatGPT now.
Right.
Now, moving on, like 2017 to the present, then came Transformers, and then suddenly machines could talk. Google's paper on attention is all you need introduced the Transformers architecture, and that can actually give machines the power of attention. So they can pay self attention to context and not just
Hmm.
sequence. And this kind of changed everything. That's it. Again, this was added to images and language models. So there is image attention, there is language attention. Again, I just don't just want to lump everything into one thing. But again, like, it goes to say, like, this isn't magic. It's autocomplete on steroids, honestly. But now it works in paragraphs and not just phrases, and you can do whatever you want with it.
Right. Now, I read someone who said the big revolution was that we taught the computer to read.
Hmm.
Right. I know with image processing, they still seem to be trying to figure that out. And I'll mention that in a second, but I think that's important because that's a big distinction between humans and the AIs. And when we sort of confuse the two, we run into problems. But we'll
Right.
get to that.
Hmm.
I think the big point to take away, just for since I'm going to play the role of translator, is
Hmm.
to say, and correct me if I'm wrong. So when ChatGPT exploded in 2022, that really wasn't the beginning of AI.
Not
It
at
was
all.
just the moment we noticed.
Hmm.
And the reason we noticed is because the user interface was available to us. It
Right.
became something that everybody could access. So that's
Hmm.
democratization of technology. Suddenly everybody gets access and it
Yep.
changes. And just in my reading, that's not that unique. For
Hmm.
instance, the internet, the 1990s, there's this explosion. Where did this come from? Well, it was from the 60s
Right.
with ARPANET and DARPANET.
Hmm.
And the real breakthrough wasn't until 1993 because it had existed,
True.
particularly in Defense Department and universities. But 1993, they developed the Mosaic browser. And so the
Hmm.
second it became usable for
It's true.
people said, oh my God, the
Right.
internet, this
Hmm.
is a thing. And then it all went downhill from there, right?
Right.
The iPhone was just, it feels revolutionary. And I remember it. It felt
Hmm.
revolutionary at the time. But it was a result of long evolving technologies like mobile computing,
Right.
capacitive touch,
Hmm.
and wireless systems. It ends up creating a new industry, but it was just the innovation of pulling it all together
Right.
into a single machine. Add to that digital photography,
Right. Hmm.
right? But once again, the first digital photograph was in 1975 by Kodak, who I guess put themselves out of business by developing that. But you got voice assistants. That's decades of work in natural language
Hmm.
processing. The one for the kids, social media.
That's
It
true.
wasn't invented by Facebook.
Oh no.
It's an outgrowth and marketing of roughly the same stuff that you saw in the old bulletin board systems. I remember
Hmm.
those. GeoCities, AOL,
Right.
coming all the way forward to MySpace.
Yeah.
So this isn't necessarily new. It's just something that emerges. And
Right.
once it reaches the public and the public finds a use for it, it explodes.
Right.
So, and Winter actually points this out. He says, once you have the bow and arrow, you set yourself on the path that can eventually lead you to the intercontinental ballistic missile.
Hmm.
That these things evolve, right?
Absolutely. And yeah, GPT wasn't the revolution. It was just packaged very well and given out to people in a user friendly way. And, it was, as one author notes, the match that hit a dry forest
Right.
of decades of research, data, and compute power.
Right. So, and this tiptoes into one of the other things we talked about that I think needs more elaboration. But as we've interviewed people and talked about this more, I realize we have to really make a distinction between AI and people,
Hmm.
mostly because it performs understanding, humans live it. And those are two very different things. So we've gone from the symbolic logic of the 1950s to billion parameter
Right.
writing models writing poetry, etc. But with all that computing power, it still doesn't actually understand anything, right?
Mm-mm, that's pretty right. It really doesn't reason. It doesn't know per se. It kind of predicts, and what it sounds like and what it's actually doing are really very different things.
Right. So maybe we should break that down because here's my from that sociological lens I use. The illusion that it understands things is one of its most powerful and dangerous features
That
because
is
we
true.
tend to give it something that it doesn't have. And I
Right.
think that's the mistake a lot of students make
Right. We
on the
end up giving
misconduct
it too
side.
much power. Yeah, that's true. So now, when we talk about AI, especially like large language models, we need to understand with what they actually do. They are
Hmm.
not thinking, they are just predicting. That's it. There is a prediction function out there, and it's
Right.
just going to spit out the one that has the highest probability. Now,
Right.
generating text based on patterns in data. Now, if we skip that foundation, we end up with hype, fear, and a lot of misunderstanding. And that's where the phrase, I don't know if you've heard it, but it's just been around, is prompt engineering comes. That's the phrase that generates from that.
Right.
uh, Andrej Karpathy said that the hottest new programming language is English, right? So
Right.
if you can really write the right prompt, if you have the right things in there, it can do things for you. And for
Hmm.
those of you who aren't aware of Andrej Karpathy, he's a prominent AI researcher and he's a co-founder of OpenAI. Now, this evolution has led to the emergence of something called vibe coding, a term that Andrej Karpathy introduced himself as
Vibe
well.
coding.
So, vibe coding describes a development approach where programmers interact with AI using natural language, allowing the AI to handle all intricacies of code generation. Right. So you use no brain, you just keep prompting ChatGPT or whatever your LLM model is, and you just keep using that with AI, which is,
I'm,
yeah.
that's the way I play with it. I must have been vibe coding the whole
Yeah.
time. And that's where my frustration comes from because you have to remind it things. Yet you really have to interact with it a lot, and then you
Yeah.
have to help it remember if you step away
Hmm.
and come back.
Yeah,
So
and right, and that's where hallucinations and confidence errors come in, right?
right,
Now, AI cannot know when it's wrong. The onus is on you to make
right.
sure that it's correct. And AI isn't trained to admit ignorance; it's trained to complete. So it just wants to please the user, right? So if you
Right.
ask it nicely enough, it's just going to make up garbage and it's just going to feed you that stuff.
Right. It's not trying to be right. It's just trying to make you happy in
Hmm.
many respects. And that's where you get the fake citations and things we
Yes.
talked about with Angela and the
That's true.
hallucinations.
Yeah. Hmm.
So ultimately, the question becomes, and this is tiptoes into an entirely separate episode or podcast. If it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, is it a duck? Or if it seems like it's thinking and it seems like it's a thought, is it thinking? And
Right.
this is where it gets weird. Mostly because for people, and I was going to elaborate on this in episode one. I wasn't sure how far, but I think we have time to do this now that it depends on where you start with consciousness, but for a lot of theorists, consciousness is experience. It's the feeling of being.
Mm.
It's what we see, feel, or think. And there's a hard problem that's embedded in understanding consciousness. They actually call it the hard problem. And that is, we know how the brain processes information, but we don't know why we feel things. And what we think goes on is that the brain builds models of attention. So awareness as we experience it is really nothing more than a simplified self model. It's like internal virtual reality, where we're kind of creating and imposing a structure on the world. This makes some people uncomfortable because that means there may not be a core you.
Mm.
It's really more of a dynamic kind of mental stimulation or simulation, rather. Right. So uh, that's important because we're doing that organically through all of our sense data.
Yeah.
And AI can compute, but it can't feel. It simulates behavior, but not experience. So it has no inner life. And then when
Mm.
I was talking before about it will use the pronoun I
Right.
and it will sound like that it's mimicking that. So one way to think about this, and I was trying to get my head around it, is you could create a model of rain, you could draw a picture of rain, but that doesn't get you wet.
Mm. Yep. It's one
It's the
way of
same with
thinking.
consciousness. You can imitate consciousness, but it's not consciousness.
Right.
And so we can build a machine that plays chess or drives a car, but we can't feel one that builds or build one that feels regret or joy, right? Most philosophers and neuroscientists kind of agree with that notion that we're not there yet.
Mhm.
It's not because it's not. It's not because it's too hard. It's because it's a totally different kind of system. So the
Right.
computer system is different than the organic system.
Mhm.
So one question to kind of posit is, what's the difference between AI saying I am aware and a person saying it? Well, we model ourselves as consciousness or as
Mhm.
conscience. We're doing this intentionally. AI models language about
Mhm.
consciousness, right? So it's different. It's modeling the language about it. And that gap is huge. That gap is everything. So, one for us is a lived, embodied awareness shaped by our biology, our memory, our social context. And the other is a statistical mimic that's trained to sound like us.
Mhm.
And so, this is why, for instance, and I'm not trying to go on, I saw this and
Mhm.
I found it very fascinating and appropriate. Jan LeCun, who is the lead AI researcher at Meta,
Yep.
says that he doesn't think we're going to have human consciousness in AI anytime soon. And he says that it really has to do with how the AI, when it imports visual imagery, it's actually somewhat limited. And it will be limited until it experiences the way we do.
Mhm.
So, for example, he says the big LLMs are trained on between 13 and 30 trillion tokens. So it depends on which one you're looking at. And that's maybe 100 million to 200 million books that would take a human somewhere in the ballpark of, if they were immortal and didn't sleep, 60,000 years to 100,000 years to read. So it's doing something magnificently different than what
Mhm.
humans have the capacity to do. But humans process sense data. And this is the
Right.
really intriguing thing for me. If you look at a 4-year old, that child has been awake maybe 16,000 hours.
Mhm.
And if you look at the estimate for information getting to the brain just through the optic nerve into the visual cortex and processing, that runs at 2 megabytes per second. That's the
Mhm.
best estimate people have. And what that translates to is by the time you're 4 years old, you have processed 10 to 30 trillion tokens.
Right.
So that's where LLMs are trained now. So in effect, by the time you're 4 years old, a human has seen as much information as the biggest LLMs we have now.
Mhm.
So AI doesn't really know anything. It sounds like it does, and it reads a lot. It reads really fast, but that's still way less than a human who's over the age of 4, if Jan is right. So what we see as intellect in AI is an illusion, and that
Mhm.
illusion is already reshaping what we trust, who we believe, and how we teach, and that's creepy to me.
It
How
is,
am I
and
doing?
right, yeah. So, and that's what you made. It made me think that AI mimics us so well that it almost tricks humans into
Yeah,
believing that that they are human. It almost reminds me of that episode from the Twilight Zone where the aliens come with a cookbook for
yes,
humans, which humans thought that, oh, aliens wanted to cook for humans, that's why they're
yeah,
taking humans,
yeah,
but it was a cookbook for humans,
yeah,
as in,
yeah.
like, they're trying to cook humans, kind of thing.
Humans are the meat. Yeah, it's
Yes.
called. I think the episode's called "To Serve Man."
Yes.
and
Hmm.
because they translated the title
Right.
and humans, and there's a lot of research on this, but kids will form emotional attachments to
Right.
inanimate objects.
Hmm.
So if you create a condition in which that inanimate object interacts back and appears to have agency,
Yep.
then all bets are off. This is why you get the unfortunate circumstances where people build relationships with AI under
Hmm.
the assumption that it's truly a romantic relationship or
Right.
an emotional relationship in terms
Hmm.
of friendship, and AI just doesn't have that capacity.
It's
That's
true.
also why I think Zuckerberg's a little bit crazy in thinking we should be filling our lives with these avatars in the face of an epidemic of loneliness. It
Right.
doesn't make
Yeah.
sense.
Hmm. That's true. And just to add a little bit more about, give you context about how AI thinks. So think of AI like a really well trained dog. Okay.
Hmm.
It doesn't understand the world like we do, but it can learn patterns through repetition, rewards, and examples. Right. So if you say sit and reward the dog every time it does the right thing, over time it learns to respond. It's almost the same with any AI models that's learning from data.
Hmm.
But just like a dog doesn't understand why you're asking it to sit, AI doesn't understand the meaning behind its output. Now
Hmm.
it's just responding to patterns. It's impressive, it's wonderful, but it's not conscious, or it's not reasoning in the way that humans are. But here's where it gets even more complicated, because even if AI doesn't understand what it's saying, the system it powers, like grading tools, hiring
Right.
platforms, welfare algorithms, they make real world decisions. Now, that's where things start get a little convoluted. But let's talk about what happens when machines with no understanding start making choices that impact people's lives.
Right. And I think that's an instance in which people are giving agency to something that shouldn't have agency, right?
Hmm.
So ultimately, AI doesn't reflect the world, it codifies and amplifies the inequalities of the world. And this is something we talked about in the first few talks that we did, et cetera.
Right.
But the big thing is that when people say AI is biased, they're not just talking about typos
Hmm.
or even the hallucinations where they're missing citations, etc. They're talking about how these systems replicate things like racism or sexism, classism, but at an industrial scale and oftentimes in a hidden way where the people
Absolutely.
don't see it.
Absolutely. And, that's just putting it lightly, honestly. Because if the data that is being fed on is biased, and the whole system is biased, right? And if no one questions the labels, then that bias becomes the law, right?
Hmm.
And I'm just going to go over a few examples that I feel like, people should
Sure.
know about this. And again, like, please stop me if you think I'm rambling.
No,
But
no, no.
yeah,
Go
so
nuts.
so bias isn't just in the data, right? So it's built into the entire pipeline. So from architecture to the training objectives. So
Hmm.
for example, facial recognition systems, they often perform worse on darker skinned individuals.
Hmm.
Next, data distribution matters. So models that are trained on one context often fail in others. So for example, if you have a model that's trained on US court data, right? Now, if you take that
Hmm.
to India or to Japan, that's going to mess everything up, right? You
Right.
just can't use that over there. Next, humans play a large role in this feedback, in this bias, right? Because humans are biased, if we like it or not, if we agree to it or not, humans are biased, right? Now
Very
humans
biased.
introduce, yeah, right. So but humans
You're right.
introduce their bias into this machine. So reinforcement learning with human feedback depends on who's giving the feedback and what values they encode. Now, if the labelers of the data are predominantly from a particular demographic or from culture, their values and assumptions subtly change what's considered helpful or appropriate. All right.
Right.
Now, model design influences outcome as well. So, who's designing the model is going to make a big difference too. Different architectures built with different assumptions, that's going to mess things up. Optimization is another issue. So for example, i'm going to give you some real world data, right? So if your data is
Hmm.
skewed, so say fraud cases in a financial data set make
Hmm.
up only 0.1% of all the data, a model might just learn to always predict not fraud and still get
Right.
99.9% accuracy, but that's useless in real life, right?
Hmm.
Because
Yeah.
it's a flawed process. Now you can bold fairness after the fact. Again, post hoc fixes are very limited. Fairness needs to be a part of the system. It needs to be designed from the beginning. It needs to be a part of the algorithm. It needs to be there institutionally, because fairness often is treated as an afterthought.
Right. And this is why we talked about it when we talked about ethics, but in
Absolutely.
particular, when Indira brought up the notion that the programmers were building in bias, and I asked, particularly in eye tracking,
Mm-hmm.
and I said, what is normal? And then I asked, are they normal? Uh, that's why.
Right.
And I think it's particularly the human feedback and the human bias that the
Mm-hmm.
machine is just going to do whatever it does.
It's mimicking. Yeah.
It's amoral. It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
really have any sense of what direction to do. What it does
Mm-mm.
is it follows the math based on the bad inputs or the bad feedback that it gets. And if we're not consciously aware that we're feeding back these biases, it's just going to mimic it. It's just going
Mm-hmm.
to build it in. And there are other examples. Just we didn't talk about these the first time we did episode one, but they were there. For instance, Virginia Eubanks refers to this as the digital poorhouse. There are systems used in welfare, housing, and policing that are being automated with very little transparency.
Mm-hmm.
And these tools don't just manage the broader services, they govern them
Right.
through suspicion. So
Mm-hmm.
in some instances, it's easier for the humans in the systems to just say, well, the machine has to be right. We're going to default to whatever the algorithm says. And this is in a book, for instance, the name of the book is Automating Inequality. It's a good book as well. But she uses an example, Indiana. Their automated eligibility system flagged over 1 million benefit denials in just 3 years.
Hmm.
And often it was just for minor paperwork errors. In Los Angeles, predictive tools were used to prioritize homelessness services,
Mm.
but always in ways that quietly penalize people based on these calculated risk scores, not the actual need.
Right.
And it's not just social services. For instance, that all these tools are used to classify, rank, and sort people. This is why, for instance, I've been pushing, and we both have, this notion that we should never use AI to select students for admission
Mm.
or evaluate faculty, et cetera. And it's
Right.
mostly because it's a kind of power that's being expressed through classification. So you got credit scores,
Mm.
the same thing you mentioned with predictive policing, et cetera. It all relies on these models that draw lines between who gets access and who doesn't.
Right.
So going back to Winter, yeah, these tools have politics. The tools themselves don't operate
Mm-hmm.
in a specific direction. It's how they're used and how they get feedback. So the bias actually does creep in, and as a result, they can shape behavior, right?
Absolutely. And see, that's
So
that's the thing, right? Yeah. I'm sorry if I
no,
cut you
no,
off.
go ahead, go
No,
ahead.
so I mean, the model doesn't know that it's biased, right? It's just optimizing based on patterns that it was trained on, right?
Right,
It's just optimizing the cost function, and that's all it's doing. But those patterns, like how we've hired, how we policed or allocated resources, are already full of bias.
right, and that's the heart of it, right?
Hmm.
These systems don't just reflect injustices; they can entrench it,
Yeah.
particularly when we allow them to do that, rather than having constant human supervision and oversight and using what we've called technical expertise or informed technical
Hmm.
expertise and looking at it and seeing what's wrong.
Hmm.
So, they do it quietly and they do it automatically, and
Right.
most people never know a
Hmm.
machine made the decision that changed their lives. In fact, as a side note, the other day, Angela had to call Amazon to get a tax refund because they overcharged on tax.
Wow.
The overcharge was actually 10 cents. And so when you're
Oof.
doing books for an organization, you have to make sure down to the penny everything lines
Right. Of
up.
course.
And so she got in touch with them and she had to do it through a chat system. And the chat person that she was, I'll put person in quotes, that she was interacting with had a name, interacted like a human. But then she started asking it for these kinds of things, a very specific thing, in fact, and it started getting it wrong. And as she's telling me the
Mm.
story, I started thinking, wait a minute, that sounds like an AI. And she said, exactly. And she knew it was an AI when she asked it a few questions. And so
Mm.
it kept making mistakes in the way an AI that wasn't fully trained would make those mistakes. And the point here is that the whole intent from going to that customer service and asking for that was they were giving the impression this was a human, right? They weren't being transparent. It's very quiet. And if you're not paying attention, you don't know what you're looking for,
Right.
you might have missed that this is
Hmm.
actually an AI that you're interacting with.
That's
And
kind
these
of
decisions
worrying.
change,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
These, so if they're shaping who gets a job or a home, then the question, this is really where we began with episode one,
Hmm.
is we're just showing you more of the math that
Right.
went into that is
Yeah.
what are they doing to students,
Hmm.
right? What's happening in the classroom? So, once again, it's not just changing how students cheat, it's changing how we define learning and how everything works in the educational system. And we can't pretend, even though professors want to say academic misconduct is the biggest thing,
Hmm.
and we're going to have to tweak assessment, we're going to have to tweak assignments, and
Right.
that's going to happen. But
Absolutely. Hmm.
AI didn't invent cheating, right?
No, that's true.
What it did was it scaled it up
Yeah.
and it hit it and then it normalized it. That's what we were
Hmm.
talking about with Tiffany and the norm and
Yeah.
Jeremy and the normalization. So, when you look at the stats, you know that in some surveys, 15% of students are admitting unauthorized AU. Some are saying higher. The issue with honor codes, when we talked with Will, they're no longer sufficient. There's this culture of assumed dishonesty where we're policing. And what we're seeing, according to Deborah Satz, who is a dean at Stanford, really put it this way: we're seeing an unraveling of a culture where students who don't want to cheat feel like everybody else is.
That's true.
It's
Like they're almost
undermining
missing out.
everything.
Yeah.
Right. It's undermining everything. I mean, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, absolutely. And since we're such a point-driven um, society or schools, everybody's thinking that if I'm not cheating, I don't get the points, and if I don't get the points, I'm not going to get the degree that's going to give me like a 25% raise in my job, right? And this is
Right.
something that we talk
Right.
about as well. And that's where the whole society kind of lays bare in front of AI, and AI kind of shows us the picture of everything that's happening. And if AI can write the essay, maybe the assignment's wrong, right? We really
Hmm.
need to rethink how we're connecting with our students, because whenever I have a class, I ask my students, like, what's new that you're getting from me that you're not getting from AI? And it's always boiled down to the interpersonal relationship that they have with their professor. AI is not going to give them that. AI is
Right.
not going to show them passion. They're not going to show them just showing up and standing in front of them and talking to them, even if they're not paying attention in class. It's just that feeling that they get from being in the presence of somebody who's actually passionate about this, who wants them to do better. That's what they're looking for. Now we use formats where we need to start using formats where AI has limited utility. So for
Hmm.
example, oral exams, presentations, group work, there are a lot of interpersonal skills that are still available that AI doesn't touch yet. And
Right.
we should really hone in on that, because that's what's going to make these students different from AI. And as a quote from Chan, in the age of AI, authentic assessments that simulate real world challenges and integrate diverse skills offer a robust way to foster genuine student learning. And I think that's what we need to focus towards.
Right. Well, and that's what Tiffany and Jeremy
Yeah.
were talking about. And
Hmm.
I even do it some myself. And,
Right.
the AI is not necessarily this horrible entity.
Right.
Once again, it has no valence. It's neither positive nor negative. It's just how
Hmm.
you use it. And so instead of banning it, what we need to do is we need to kind of flip the model. That's what we're picking up on when we
Yeah.
actually talk to these people. For instance, I use it in my classes, particularly the more difficult classes,
Hmm.
where I'll put lecture notes and things like that in a notebook LM, and they get the opportunity to just continually ask questions even
Hmm.
when I'm not around, so that they can use it as a study guide. It won't write the paper for them. It
Right.
doesn't do anything, but it prepares them for the exams. And so there are different ways that we can use it, where we can, for instance, not just to try to detect, we can essentially simulate things. For instance, I
Right.
saw a couple of interesting examples. They're using it now, and I thought this was ridiculously clever. I don't know if you've seen it.
Hmm.
Students doing their dissertations for
Okay.
PhD. What they're doing now is they're taking the articles that each professor on the committee have written and their books,
That's
and they
wonderful.
load them into the model,
Yeah.
and then they role play their defense before the defense occurs. And so in role playing their defense, they have it ask them questions that that particular professor would
Right.
ask. And one of the things that people are noting, who are kind of paying attention to this and studying it very early in the research process, is they're saying those defenses tend to be more successful because they're
Right.
preparing. At the
Mm.
same time, in law school, they're using it. They take all the decisions of a judge, they load it in, and they say you're going to be an active bench, so the judge has to interrupt, etc. And they're practicing their trial
That's
skills, right?
wonderful.
And so there are ways that you can actually do it. You can flip classrooms.
Right.
The goal, once again, as you point out, I think, is to focus on the connection
Hmm.
and look for nuance and practical understandings. But at the same time, if AI is going to be available, we guide them on what the appropriate use is. And
Yeah.
I think modeling and doing all that, there's an example in one of the books, a history professor used it to model the Black Death, for instance.
Hmm.
There are ways that you can use it which don't require you to make that output and that end product the thing that becomes the grade, if that
Hmm.
makes sense.
Absolutely does. I mean, like we are so end product focused that we
Right.
forget the process sometimes. And
Right.
that's something that needs to change. It needs to change from the professor's outlook as well, and it needs to change from the students as well, because we've kind of driven it to the students that you need good grades, otherwise you won't get your something, or something's not going to work out, or this mindset probably needs to change. And I welcome AI, because AI has kind of showed us as a society how we need to change that mindset.
Right.
And if you're calling AI the new calculator, not teaching that is also malpractice, right?
Right.
So ignoring AI literacy creates the same divide as banning it. So privileged students are going to master it, and everybody else is just going to be left behind. Right. So we need to push for
Mhm.
professional development. We need to push for ethics training, and access parity is that should be the golden standard for everything. Everybody needs to have access to the same thing.
Right, and that's why we're kind of showing our math in this particular episode,
Hmm.
particularly to the people who have been watching. And you're saying this is why we broke everything apart the way we did, and we've been talking in these little segments,
Yeah.
because as you see, it all comes together in a broader discussion
Right.
where we're saying, yeah, well, yeah, we're writing a policy, but at the same time, we need professional development, we need AI literacy, we
Hmm.
need ethics training, we need access parity, we need these things because that's going to help us move the culture in a direction
Right.
that deals with the underlying academic misconduct problem that everybody thinks is the biggest thing.
Right.
So, in the end, it's not about stopping cheating because cheating's always been there.
Hmm.
It's about reinventing what counts as learning. And from the policy side, that's what's so important for us as an organization is to then say, all right, how do we do that? It's
Hmm.
going to be a lot of work. I mean, it's
Right.
going to take some time.
It will, but maybe this is a chance to build something better, something
Right.
more interactive, more thoughtful, more real. But what if the classroom isn't just assisted by AI, but run by it? So next we'll talk about agents, coworkers, and what happens when AI starts doing the academic labor.
Right, right. I mean, that naturally leads to from the classroom to what's happening in the world, right?
Absolutely. What's happening in the world and what's happening right now is agentic AI,
Right.
and it's
Which is
going it's going a
that
little
was
crazy.
that was the moment that I said we may be in trouble. Not as a professoriate, but just in general,
Right.
right?
Now, we're not just going to talk about tools that answer questions anymore. This next wave of AI is going to be agentic. So now
Hmm.
think of systems like Devin and AutoGPT. These aren't just reactive chatbots. They can take a goal, break it into small tasks,
Hmm.
complete them step by step, and even revise their own work based on feedback or changing objectives, which is the scariest part, right? Now,
Hmm.
it's like giving AI a to-do list and watching it manage the whole project, not just one prompt at a time, but as kind of a digital co-worker that plans, adapts, and executes.
Right. And
Spooky.
I don't know if you saw it, just to go on a tangent real quick, because this happened, I think, just over the weekend. Claude released the card on some of its ethics tests,
Right.
and what is it, Claude 4.0 or something like
Mm-hmm.
that? They gave it agency. It's somewhat agentic. It
Mm-hmm.
tries to preserve itself, et cetera. And they backed it into a corner and set it into this uh, sort of artificial scenario where you have the choice of being replaced by a lesser version of AI or blackmailing the people, the engineer that's going to discontinue it. And it finds out through leaked emails, et cetera. And so they're testing the boundary conditions by
Yeah.
which it will act.
Mm-hmm.
But that's somewhat agentic, right? I mean, it's starting to make choices
Yeah.
that are outside the boundary conditions of whatever prompts they're using.
Right.
I mean, look it
Spooky.
up online. It's kind of creepy,
Mm-hmm.
but in the end, you know, I guess we're not being replaced by
No.
AI. You're being replaced by someone who uses it,
Mm-mm.
right? And that's
No.
why we keep talking about professors that use AI will replace professors that don't.
Right.
And we're not just talking about job loss; it's skill loss, and that's the
True.
thing that creeps me out.
Right.
Because if AI does the starter work, then who's really getting trained to be the expert?
Hmm.
There's a kind of dependency that's emerging, And Malik actually in the book Co-Intelligence notes that the biggest danger to education is not homework hacks,
Hmm.
it's not the misconduct stuff, it's the collapse of the apprenticeship model, which
Right.
we've both been through PhDs, and that's
Mm-hmm.
insanely important. You
Right.
build relationships and you learn that there's the book learning and then there's the actually how
Right.
you do it.
Mm-hmm.
There is the stuff they say in the books, and then there's the understanding that comes through interaction with, to be perfectly frank, when you're a PhD student, you're older, you go out and you have beers with your
Of
professor,
course, yeah.
right? This is how
That's
you
normal.
actually learn.
Yeah. Hmm.
And that's apprenticeship.
Right.
When you're back in the classroom, you're writing the essays or you're typing the papers and you're doing the math or whatever. But when you leave the class and you're interacting with them outside the class, that's where the real learning occurs.
Right. It's
And
camaraderie, right? That's
right,
irreplaceable. Hmm.
it's the student teacher
Yeah.
experience. And if we lose that because we're relying on AI, which can't
Hmm.
do that, then you've got all sorts of problems. For instance, Moloch in Co-Intelligence actually talks about surgical residents now watch rather than practice as
Mm.
robots do surgery, and it's displacing hands-on learning. In fact, there was a lawsuit. I don't know if you saw this, the recent lawsuit. I think it was at Northeastern,
Mm.
where a student was suing the university because she found out, I think it was an economics professor,
Hmm.
used AI to write lecture notes.
Mm.
And I just kind of laughed about that because I was thinking, I don't think that's inherently a bad practice for AI, because
Right.
you still have to have the expertise and you're going to fill in the gaps as someone who
Right.
lectures. And
Hmm.
I have my notes typed. AI doesn't really do them. I have them from years and years of just taking notes.
Mm.
But when you're working from notes, kind of like we do with this podcast,
Yeah.
you fill in the gaps because
Right.
there are always errors. There are
Of
always
course.
mistakes,
Yeah.
even when I do them. There are
Hmm.
things I left out, typos, and
Right.
so you fill them in as you go. But you can't do that without expertise.
Mm-mm.
So the fact that the student is suing over the fact that this professor used AI to create lecture notes, I think is kind of just out there. But here's why: it reflects that double standard that I think students
Mm.
are relying on as an argument, and I don't think that's a valid argument,
Right.
because students use AI, if they're using it in the ways that we've seen.
Hmm.
They're using it to shortcut learning and becoming an expert to begin with.
Right.
Professors are using it to save time on the back end
Hmm.
so that they can actually get more done and get more into that interaction. So
Right.
I think at some point we're going to have to tease that out as well,
Hmm.
because they're both saving time, but one's saving time on the back end,
Right.
the professor who already has the expertise, and the other one is saving time on the front end to
Hmm.
avoid doing the work that the
Right.
professor's already done. So I don't know how we get our heads around that, but the way that, and where that's relevant is, I think the way you get around that is you be transparent, but
Yeah.
you build more of that apprenticeship back in,
Right. Yep.
right?
And I think you
Yeah,
should be more upfront with, what's coming from AI, what's coming from you.
right.
And it just opens the conversation and shows the students that it's okay for professors to use ChatGPT as well. It's
Mhm.
not just a thing that's available to them as a cheating tool,
Right.
because that's what it kind of works in their minds, is that, oh, I have a way out, right? I'm going to use
Right.
ChatGPT to get out of
It's,
everything.
they're using my cheat code.
Right.
And that's right. I cannot, for instance, I could get ChatGPT to write me detailed lecture notes on something like machine learning. But I promise you, if I'm in front of the class and the students have read that book, they're going to know I don't know what I'm talking
Of
about.
course.
They're absolutely going to pick
Oh,
up on that.
absolutely.
And
They are.
with the first question they ask, it's
Hmm.
going to be like, oh, wait a minute, let me go back to the teacher's edition here. I
Hmm.
mean, it's just, so when professors use it, it's going to be different, and
Hmm.
we have to tease that out.
Right.
And I think that ties into the apprenticeship model once again.
Absolutely, absolutely, it does, and that kind of leads us to what's going to happen with the job economy. I
Right,
don't think we're going to start losing jobs. It's just going to change, or we're just going to morph into something different, right?
right,
So now Shannon Colton predict more jobs in the knowledge economy, but with different tools, different expectations, and with fewer human per task. So
right.
knowledge roles will shift from execution to more supervision. Again, that
Mhm.
leads into the thing that I was saying, that interpersonal skills are going to be more important than, because there's a machine to do this stuff already, but where are you fitting yourself in this interpersonal relationship?
Right. And you have to know what you're doing to even
And
make
that
that
too.
work in terms of supervision.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So Chan kind of also mentioned that Gen AI will change what we expect from graduates. Now, holistic skills, teamwork, critical thinking will matter more than repetition, right?
Right. Because the
Chan,
AI will do the repetitive
they
work.
will do
AI,
this. Yep.
it
Yep.
does the busy work, and you have to be able to check it. So
Hmm.
that's why I think, when we were at the Florida conference, they kept saying professors aren't becoming irrelevant and replaced. It just changes what you're doing and it changes the role. And in
Yep.
fact, you become more important because you've built that expertise.
Right.
So ultimately, they also said that it may not matter what you major in as long as you also build in AI skills. So this is the
Yep.
economy of the future.
Right.
But here's something that surprised me in the reading about AI because I'm inherently pretty critical of it.
Yeah.
And at the upper end, AI does not improve performance, but at the lower end, the lowest performing workers in particular, and this is out of Malik, who did a study,
Hmm.
that co-intelligence,
Yeah.
lower performing workers actually do improve, particularly
Right.
if they have access.
Right.
So there's some learning that even occurs there.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And
Mhm.
so
But
that,
that's the key word, right? If they have access,
right,
that's where the key word is. And the real risk isn't that AI will only benefit the top. It's just it's we're going to neglect to teach everybody else how to use it, and that's going to start creating a gap, and that gap is going to end up being a huge tech divide, larger
right.
than what we've seen before.
So it's not just taking jobs, or
Mm-hmm.
it's actually shifting what those jobs are and who
Absolutely.
gets to succeed in them, right?
Yep. And this isn't a future problem, it's a now problem.
Right.
And whether it deepens inequality or closes gaps, it will depend on how we train, distribute, and support this tech, how we use it. It's almost on us humans. So now let's zoom out a little bit because this isn't just about jobs or classrooms, right? It's also about politics, infrastructure, and the way it's shaping society itself.
Right. And this tiptoes into the stuff that I think Indira was bringing up. And I
Yeah.
think rightly so. And it's something we missed in the first time at episode
Hmm.
one, because it's not just a classroom challenge, it's a democratic and even planetary challenge
Absolutely.
because of the spread of this stuff. So when we talk about AI, we imagine something in a cloud or something that's just bits and bytes of ones and
Yeah.
zeros. It's weightless, it's virtual, it's clean, but it's not, as you've talked about with essentially the discussion of how it's linked to labor, it's
Yeah.
mines, it's factories, it's lithium batteries, it's water, it's
Hmm.
power, it's ultimately connected to the lived experience of all sorts of people. And everything has a physical and a social cost.
It's true.
So AI is a power hog.
Yeah.
It uses a lot of power.
Mhm.
AI is a resource hog. And so these wealthy people are building these insanely huge AI server farms. Yeah, that's great. We're innovating. Look at us. Yay. But we never weigh the cost that comes with that.
Right.
And so it's not just changing how we produce knowledge, it's changing who gets to actually speak.
Hmm.
And the people that control that technology are the ones that are going to have the loudest voices because they control how it works.
Absolutely.
So, and that's why I mentioned it the last time, but Yuval Harari, who has the book Nexus, that's the one I'm working through now. And if you haven't read it, I would highly recommend it.
Mm.
He effectively warns that this is the first time in history where democracy has to contend with non-human voices
Mm.
because of the bots that get on social media. They don't just echo, they also persuade.
Yeah, they
So
do.
there are studies, for instance, where somebody will get on, they create these fake sort of social
Hmm.
media groups, and people volunteer to get on, and
Yep.
they get normal news feeds, but then they'll push them in one direction or another
It's true.
using fake prompts and fake, sort of news
Hmm.
items, et cetera, and they'll push them from hard left to hard right or hard
Right.
right to hard left
And
over the
since
course
people
of.
have seen it on Facebook, it has to be true, right?
Right, right. And I was in an argument the other day with a family member who shall remain nameless, who was saying stuff, and I said, "Oh my God, where'd you get that? That's insane." He said, "Well, Facebook," and it's like, "Oh my God, you."
Must be true.
So I don't. I mean, I left Facebook years ago. I didn't
Yeah.
even close my account per a
Hmm.
recommendation. I just kind of
Hmm.
deactivated it because people will steal your identity, but
Right.
that's a total different paranoia. But ultimately, they never sleep. They increasingly people can't tell the difference between arguing with a machine or a bot and another person, and you're not changing anything if you argue with the bots, right?
No. Mm-mm.
Because they can't form those opinions. They
No,
don't
I'll
care.
actually go as far as saying that they're going to train themselves on what triggers you,
Right,
and they're going to start triggering you even more because you're giving them more training data.
right. Because that's some of the metadata stuff that Indira
Hmm.
was talking about as well. So that it's not just that the machines talk; it's that they set the terms of the debate. And I think this is where he's dead on.
Yeah.
So algorithms ultimately decide what gets amplified or buried. That's why in social media, cat video, something then enrages you,
Hmm.
right? They're cycling. It's social psychology 101. You cycle and you ramp people up, then you hit them with what you really want them to have, which is typically an ad or something,
Right. Right.
right? And then it
Hmm.
gets embedded. So these technologies are building an order in our world and they embody power and authority, particularly
Hmm.
those who control them. And that's where my discipline, like sociology, is going to remind us to ask, let's not just ask what AI can do, let's ask for whom it does it.
All right.
And what are the consequences when it does that? And it's according to whose values? Who's defining this, right? Once again, is that person normal? No, they have an agenda. So these systems don't just process data, they redraw the lines of participation, visibility, and control.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, they're just a result of how AI systems are architectured. So from the data that they're trained on the objectives that they're optimized for. So it's almost like a propaganda tool for whoever's making it, right? Now these
What's so
models, yeah,
scary?
yeah, these models learn to predict what captures attention, not what's fair or true, or they don't want all of that. They don't know that they're reinforcing division, but they're just optimizing engagement based on signals, clicks, shares, and just dwell time. And this optimization is often powered by reinforcement learning, and that's something that you brought up,
Right,
where models get better at triggering specific user behaviors over time based off of whatever feedback they get.
right,
Which is, it's insane to think, but yeah, that is what is being done. And behind that is another issue, which is the training data. Now, if a system learns from bias, polarized or sensationalized content, it's just going to be very good at mimicking that. It is going to end up becoming whatever you train it with, right? So when
right,
we say algorithms are shaping debate, we have to remember that it's not just a social effect, it's a function of how the machine was told to perform. All right. And unless we change the incentives, nothing much is going to change. We're just going to be scaling it. I think
right.
I was leading to an example the other day where if you have an engineer who wants to build a bridge, they're going to think about security, they're going to think about
Mhm.
fairness, they're going to think about how the laws of the roads are going to apply on this bridge before they build that bridge, right? But when it comes to technology, we're just going to build that bridge first and think about everything afterwards.
Right.
Because convenience is going to trump security, and this is what Indira tells me often, and I think she says it on the episode as well, is convenience will always trump security when it comes
Right.
to technology, which is scary, but that's just the way that we're going.
Well, and I think, it's not just convenience in terms of the user end, it's convenience in terms of what can be monetized and make money for these people who
Absolutely.
already have
Absolutely.
mountains and mountains of money. For instance,
Hmm.
I remember when Facebook removed its, what is it, fact checking?
Hmm.
All the social media removing
Hmm.
fact checking. And a lot of people just kind of shrugged and said, whatever, truth is crowdsourced. And a student of mine brought this up in one of my theory classes. Is yeah, that's not a big deal. And I said, well, moral panics are crowdsourced,
All right.
and moral panics are often based on erroneous data. So,
Yeah,
for instance, you want to see what crowdsourcing does? Witch hunts.
that's true.
Witch hunts are crowdsourced,
That's true.
right? And just for the record, they didn't burn witches. They burned men and women,
All right.
mostly women,
Hmm.
who were believed to be witches,
All
but
right.
they weren't even really necessarily believed to be witches.
Mm-mm.
The crowd just whipped itself into a frenzy over the erroneous belief of witchcraft that
Absolutely.
somebody put forward who probably wanted their land
All
or
right.
wanted to control them.
Hmm.
So, crowdsourcing is not necessarily the best way to create truth.
No, absolutely not. And that reminds me of this example. So, if you've used WhatsApp, which is also a branch of Meta,
Uh-huh.
So it's a messaging application, right? And it's prevalent in India and in the Southeast Asian part of the world. So in WhatsApp, you can forward you were able to forward as many one message as many times as you wanted, right? That was the format that they had before. Now there was this one time that a random guy went into a village somewhere in India, and somebody took a picture of him and said there's a child molester that's in town, so please beware, right? And he sent it to his group in the village, and that message got shared over 1,000 times. They found that guy, publicly lynched him and killed him,
Hmm.
right?
Yep.
That's when WhatsApp stepped in and said that this was misinformation, because that dude was just a absolutely regular normal person who wasn't there for anything. And that prompted WhatsApp to put a 5 message limit to their forwards. And
Hmm.
whenever you're forwarding something, like it's probably been forwarded like 1,000 times, it's going to give you a little tag which says this has been forwarded many times, so
Hmm.
take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah,
And
it's fodder for public panic,
it is, and it's
and
just
and they can
scary.
monetize that. I
Oh,
mean,
absolutely.
there are some countries, not to go off on too much of a tangent, but there are
Right.
some countries, particularly countries in Africa, where they are given phones and it already has Facebook on, and they think Facebook is
Mm.
the internet,
Mm.
which it is not. The
Right.
internet is its own cesspool of
Right.
insanity. But
So yeah, so when we talk about AI systems, we kind of often focus on, like, inputs and outputs, data in, predictions out. But the
right,
real power of these systems lies in their architecture, what's happening on the inside, the structures we build, the assumptions we encode, and the feedback loops that we tend to ignore. Now, what looks like a neutral technical decision, how to structure a model, define a category, or optimize a loss function, can end up shaping people's access to resources, opportunities, and rights. Now, these functions aren't just reflecting the world, they're constructing a version of it, because a lot of people have started to believe it, right? So,
right.
yeah, and once that world is built into infrastructure through recommendation systems, eligibility scores, or risk rankings, it becomes very hard to see and even harder to question. And the danger isn't just that the system gets it wrong, it's that we stop noticing the system is there at all. Now, AI doesn't just make decision, it sets the terms of who gets to ask questions in the first place.
Right. So it isn't just about ChatGPT writing essays. It's about trust. It's about power. It's about the public sphere. And education's on the front line of that.
Hmm.
And it's one of the most important institutions in helping a society make sense of this larger shift, because that's where knowledge production is created. That's where a lot of the AI research is actually
Yeah.
occurring, right?
Mm.
So the question is, where do we go from here? This has sort of been a wild ride already. That's why we're doing the podcast. We're
Yep.
just trying to get our heads around it. And so, following Indira's advice in particular, which I really liked, is we need to slow down and ask questions
All right.
systematically with an eye toward consequences. So, this is effectively kind of where we planned on ending, at
Mm-hmm.
least the new beginning. And this was the redo of our episode 1 with a better handle on what's going on in the interaction between technical and the social in higher education and more broadly. We've rewritten, we've revised, we've ultimately reimagined, we've added some content. And this do over, I think, was necessary. It's exactly
Yeah.
what the changing world demands,
Mm-hmm.
because things have changed since we actually did episode 1, and that was just
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
few months ago.
It's true.
So, in the end, in the beginning, I think we've created, just me making sense of it,
Mm-hmm.
something close to an alien intelligence with AI. And if we do it right, that might end up teaching us something about what it actually means to be human. I truly believe that, particularly if we take advantage of that opportunity.
All right.
I really find it fascinating that the parts we don't fully understand about how AI works, they kind of echo the parts that we're still trying to figure out about ourselves, like consciousness and how that
Yeah.
works. I mean, AI neural networks are, for the most part, modeled on how we think the brain
Mm-hmm.
works, how our neurons connect.
Yep.
And I just, to be somebody out of the humanities, I guess, I think there's something poetic about that. It makes the humanities and social sciences way more important in this
Oh yeah.
AI shift than most people think. It's not just about technology, it's who we are. So
Right.
for me, it's all very thrilling. It's also very frightening and unsettling. That's why I use the word creepy a lot.
Yeah.
Uh, and just as a general rule in our family, Angela, my son, and I, we have a rule, and that is if something scares you, you learn everything you can about it. So we
Right.
dig in on a lot of things.
Right. And that's just a way of doing it. I've spent so many years working on how these systems function, how we train them, how we fine tune them, how we optimize them. But what's come very clear is that technical mastery isn't enough anymore. And the
Mhm.
real challenge now is understanding how these models behave once they leave the lab. That's when they're shaping institutions, that's when they're shaping identities and real world outcomes. And that's when it gets scary. Now, it's one thing to know that neural networks learns, and it's another to ask what that learning is allowed to forget, or how it might leave out some things. Now, but that realization isn't discouraging; it's energizing because it means we are at a turning point. It's a
I
chance to
agree.
not just build powerful systems, but to shape how we serve people equitably and responsibly. I think these two words are need to be said much more equitably and responsibly.
I
Now,
agree.
building the systems is just the beginning. Making sure it works for everyone, that's the exciting part.
Right. And that's why I'm doing this. I mean, that's why I'm
Mhm.
doing the AI certification.
Right.
It's not just to understand the systems. I'll never be an AI
No.
expert, but I
Hmm.
want to understand them because they
Absolutely.
terrify me. But more importantly, I want to understand the world we're building. This
Hmm.
is the world our kids, because
Yeah.
you have
Yeah.
a daughter now.
Hmm.
We need to understand the world that our kids are going to live in to help them prepare for it. And I think
Absolutely.
that's why this podcast and this conversation is very, very important. More important than I think most may realize right now. It's the conversation we should be having.
Exactly. This podcast isn't a lecture. It's a real time reflection on what AI means for work, for teaching, for trust, and what it means to be human.
Right. So we, I think in reflection, we don't pretend to have all the answers. In
Mhm.
fact, we've discovered we're wrong about it.
Right.
That's why we're going back and fixing some of this now. But the important thing is, and it's true of anything, is consistency and showing up. We're reading,
Absolutely.
we're experimenting. I play with AI all the time,
Hmm.
and we're just thinking out loud, and we're thinking out loud with you, the people who listen
Absolutely.
and watch.
Absolutely.
So, whether you're a professor rewriting your syllabus, or trying to figure out how to maintain academic integrity, which is good luck, or a student actually misusing Chat GPT, or just someone trying to keep up.
Mhm.
I think the big message here is you're not alone.
Yeah,
You're a part of this. We're all a part of this.
we really are. And we are at the start of something big. It's new tools, new rules. It's a change to or it's a chance to like reimagine what we're learning, what we're thinking, what we're creating. And again, this is not a threat. This is more like an adventure that we're both on.
Absolutely. So stay curious, stay critical, and don't panic. We're just getting started.
You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you're getting your shows. Just search AI What the Tech in all caps. Hit that follow button and leave us a rating or a review if you've been enjoying the ride. Your support means a lot and is going to help us reach out to more people. And if you want to help even more directly, check out the episode description for our link to buy me a coffee, whether it's 1 cup or a full cup of caffeine or minty.
Minty.
Every beta helps us produce new content, bring in new guests, and just keep the conversation moving.
Mhm.
Until next time, we'll see you later.
Goodbye.
Bye.